Week 2 of our Roots class, we're going to be talking about the creeds, specifically the Nicene and Apostles' creeds, and why these are important for Anglicans. This feeds directly off the conversation we had last week about Scripture. It turns out that Scripture is super diverse with all these different voices. They don't always agree, they tell lots of different stories. And Scripture's not self-interpreting. It doesn't tell you which parts are meant to be the most important or which parts ought to take the lead in the conversation. It's that realization that led Christians to realize that they needed some way of summarizing the core essentials of the Christian story. What's the story that Christians are reading primarily when they come to Scripture? And that's what the creeds were written to be, this sort of summary statement of the story that Christians read all the rest of Scripture through. Sometimes when people look at the creeds, they wonder why the creeds emphasize certain things and not others. For example, there's nothing about Jesus' teaching to be found in the creeds. The creeds aren't trying to tell the full story. They're just trying to remind you of the bits of the story that human nature or Christian practice might be prone to dropping if it were not reminded that this is an important part of the story. And with that in mind, it's interesting to note what Christians put in the creeds. Things like knowing the name of the Roman official who had Jesus crucified was deemed part of the story that we ought not forget, that we ought to read the rest of our story through. Maybe the most important thing about the creeds is that that is the moment where Christians decide that the defining way of talking about God for Christians is going to be the Trinity. And the Trinity is a fascinating topic that I don't have remotely enough time to go into right here, but allow me to say this. The Trinity is important to Christians because it reminds us that when we talk about God, we are talking about something more complicated than an invisible person in the sky somewhere. We are talking about something complicated, a divine mystery which you have to use at least 3 different ways of describing to come at. And what Christians come to realize about the Trinity is that it is not a theory about a thing that may or may not be out there. It's a way of describing what we are experiencing in our lives every single day through our relationships of love with other human beings. All that is sort of hinted at in the creeds and the way the creeds say Christians ought to tell their story, and we will go into much more detail this Wednesday. So please join us when we do. Thanks.